Okay, let's start. Welcome, everyone, to the Harvard Alumni for Education LATAM. It is truly a pleasure to be here with you all and to see again, familiar faces, as well as new ones joining our community. My name is Patricia Vasquez, and I am honored to co-direct this incredible initiative in Latin America alongside with Gustavo, who hasn't get already here, and Eric, that is already there. For those of you who might be joining for the first time, the Harvard Alumni for Education is a special interest group within the Harvard Alumni Association that connects Harvard alumni from across disciplines, professions, industries who share the passion for education. Our goal is to foster collaboration, exchange knowledge, and drive meaningful impact in education, whether in classrooms, policymaking spaces, or through innovation and entrepreneurship. I would love to say that we would love everyone to be part of HAED, if that's the abbreviation or what it stands for, Harvard Alumni for Education, and join us. It is for free. And we are a growing global network, over 4,000 public, private, and nonprofit members, including educators, parents, researchers, entrepreneurs, and policymakers. So I will just put the link of the webpage so you can join, follow us on Instagram and Facebook. I also put the accounts there. But I'm super, super, super happy to present and to talk with an amazing woman. And this is an exciting session to explore collective leadership with Radha Ruparell. I don't know, it's always different and difficult to say the names properly. So Radha, please
You've got it, Patty. It's quite good.
Okay, okay. So if I'm mistaken. And well, she's the global leader in collective leadership and transformational change. You will see and you will hear lots of inputs and insights from her experience, personal experience and professional experience. And I will kindly ask Raja just to say hello. And I think it's the best thing. So you can just introduce yourself and say like, okay, I'm Raja, I am from, and what is your favorite hobby?
Ooh, that's a good one. Uh, I am Radha. I grew up in Canada. I live in New York, but to parents who grew up in East Africa and of Indian origins. And so you'll understand now why my favorite hobby is traveling and being in new places in the world. Um, and just particularly having people host me and enjoying the food of local places. So I think it's in my bloodline.
That's amazing. That's amazing. I would not please just hola Gustavo, how are you? Long time no see. And please write your names, the place where are you from? Hola Pati. Hi everyone that is here with us. And also write your hobby if you feel like sharing what is your hobby. So Rada, um, I'm gonna just say a quick introduction of yourself. You have a very long curriculum, very extent experience in the field of education. And I will just point out that Radha is a globally recognized expert in leadership development, working at the intersection of personal transformation and system-wide change. With extensive experience coaching CEOs, Fortune 500 senior executives, social entrepreneurs, and grassroots leaders, she has dedicated her career to unlocking human potential and fostering collective leadership to drive large-scale impact. I have to say that the last time I saw or we met, Radha and I were I think last December in Salzburg. So it was just an amazing, we are part of a group of conversation about collective action. So I'm super, super happy to talk and to lead this conversation. And suddenly Eric and Gustavo will get on board. So let's welcome Radha and let's start, if that's okay with you
Sounds
all.
good.
And I would like to guide the conversation beginning with your journey and moving into Teach for All. And the latest focus, by the way, on Teach for All on collective leadership.
Yeah, let me give you a quick bit of my background.
Just pitch it up. Yeah, go ahead.
But then I'll get right into it. So yeah, just thank you for the introduction. It's great to be in this space, and I think we can all learn from one another. So I'll say a few things, but I'm excited also for the discussion. So yeah, as I mentioned, I grew up in Canada to a global family. And the reason I mentioned that is I remember when I was 12 years old, my parents had saved up money to take us out of school for 2 months and go to India. And I was just telling Patty and Eric before this, I was just in the place where my family's from. So it's a state of Gujarat. It's the state where Gandhi is from. And I remember we went down a dirt road 4 hours. I didn't know where we were going, and I walked into a little hut, and I recognized some names on the hut, and it was my ancestors. And so I was a kid at 12 years old then, and I didn't have any fancy language then, but I remember just always having questions like, "Oh wow, there's no school in this village," and the kids were amazing and resilient and full of life, and yet. Like at that point, I started having these questions. Wait, why do they have opportunity? Why do they not have opportunity than I do just by where I was born? And so that's a little bit of what was, again, inspired me around this lifelong quest of questions. Why are things the way they are? How does education make a difference? Anyways, I came from a business family. I spent many years in the private sector, spent a lot of time in healthcare. So about a decade doing work then in global health and health systems. But when I was doing work in health systems, one of the biggest things I realized is all the challenges there came down to mindsets. And when I saw change happen, it always came down to leaders, oftentimes local leaders, a woman in a community, a church leader, a parent, a government leader that despite the bureaucracy made things happen. And so after a decade of doing that work, I'd come across this organization, Teach for All, which just for any of you who are not familiar, I know many are, it's a global network of organizations, independently, locally led in now 63 countries around the world. Eric had run in Singapore, Mexico. We've got someone who was in Singapore, Argentina. And what's happening in each of these organizations is we're recruiting young people who go teach for 2 years in the most vulnerable communities. But it's not just about those 2 years, it's about every year thereafter. And so 80% of them stay on in the work, transforming the system. Because when you see the challenges, you realize, gosh, in some places, we're not even, kids don't even have the basic foundations to read or write. In other cases, we see that, girls don't have toilets. And so that's preventing them going from school. So you start getting proximate. And what our whole work at Teach for All is, well, if we're trying to transform systems, how do we grow collective leadership? So that is leadership at all levels of the system. So not just government leaders, but the leadership of students and teachers and parents and community leaders, because our hope is, how do we grow a world where students can shape a better future and they can be leaders of a better future, but that requires all of us. So I can dig into a little bit more there, but let me just pause and Patty, tell me where you'd like me to go next.
Oh, I mean, that's great. That's amazing. I think that we're here to hear you, by the way. So I will just think that it is wonderful, Radia, that you can just take us with you in your journey of what has been being part and leading this collective leadership, at least for Teach for All. But I think that some of us are working on organizations that we are trying to do something together, or at least move systemically some educational systems or educational organizations. I think that we never think about the sum of work that is around to make things happen. I think that we usually go one line and that's it with our effort and that's it. And I think that you can at least unpack much more on what this has been, what has happened, the challenges, and also the things that haven't worked truly as you expected. And I think that it's a proper moment to go into that.
Yeah, and it's good to have a real conversation. Well, let me just sometimes we throw around words and language. And so let me even bring to life a couple of examples of when I say collective leadership, what it means. And even that's one of the challenges, right? We use different words to mean different things. And maybe I'll even bring an example. I've got lots from the region, but I'm going to bring something outside of the region from a CEO who I was speaking to just yesterday. So she is, and you'll just notice what's relevant to you in your context or not. But again, I think this is applicable in any sector, in any space. But she's the CEO of Teach for Armenia. And Armenia is a country that had, come out of the Soviet rule. And so what she was sharing is, look, the history and the context was very top-down centralized leadership. And that shows up in everywhere. And by the way, so many of our systems and organizations were built in that top-down centralized way. And that actually worked for a time. And that worked for a very, very different time, right? When we didn't have access to information, when only a certain portion of people had access to education, when we had to have sort of command and control sort of economies. And the world has changed. And so what she was saying there, and again, I think in many of your contexts it could be similar, is the world is changing so fast that that way of working or that way of educating doesn't work. And so it breaks my heart when I go into classrooms, and I still go into many today, where there's a teacher in front of the room, assuming they have all the knowledge and talking to students as if they have nothing. And we know that that's not the way the world works. My little nieces and nephews know far more about many things than I do now because they have access to information. And so we've got to understand that the world has changed, access to information has changed, access to knowledge has changed, and so we can't operate the same old way. So just to build on that Armenia example, so they said, like, we need to start thinking much more collectively, first of all, about the most fundamental question: what is the purpose of education? And I have been around going to like country to country and to country and country, and I realized that so many times I walk into classrooms and they look like the same as they could have looked 50 years ago or 100 years ago. And I don't know about you, but that doesn't work. If I went into an operating theater in a hospital and the surgery room looked the same way that it was 50 years ago, that doesn't work. And yet that is so much the case in so many of the classrooms and places I go to. And so we started asking ourselves across the Teach for All network, we looked at thousands of schools where we saw a transformation happening. And we talked to school leaders and teachers and students and researchers and policymakers. And we looked at these classrooms and we said, what's happening that's different? And the first thing we saw that's happening that's different is you're actually asking, what is the purpose of education? And you're doing that collectively. And I can tell you the number of places where that is not happening. That did not happen in the school system I grew up in, right? It was around, fine, it was not a bad system, but it was around getting kids to college. But it was not around, well, how do we equip kids with the skills and mindsets that they need to operate, not just in this world, but in the future? And so collective leadership, going back to the Armenia context, was saying, okay, we're going to have those conversations. And so in a society where it used to be, you have policymakers at the top and they roll out something and then they expect people to implement, that doesn't work in these times. And so in Armenia, they started, and we're seeing this in a lot of other countries, literally just having circles and circles of conversations in many different communities, bringing together stakeholders from, students to policymakers to teachers to ask these big questions. Like, what do we want for our kids? What do we hope to be true? What is not working? And it connects to, so many of the problems we're facing. There's a disconnection with ourselves. There's mental health and loneliness crisis. There's a disconnection with our one another, like polarization. We can't talk to things that we need. We can't talk to our neighbors.
Sorry, Radha.
Yeah. So as you start having these conversations in these communities, you start realizing, gosh, like if we can actually start having a different conversation around what are we educating for, it's going to make a real difference on all of the challenges we're facing, whether it's the mental health crisis, whether it's the fact that we can't even talk to our neighbors or someone who has a difficult political view, the conflicts that we're facing, our disconnection with our planet. So much of that happens because, our education systems are almost like factory models, trying to churn people through the wheel, focused on a lot of individual achievement. They've lost our sense of connectedness. And so that's what started happening. So we're seeing this in Armenia, we're seeing this in Peru, we're seeing this in Chile, where they're actually starting to have real conversations around what's the purpose of education. And this is not easy work, right? Because oftentimes we're not even talking to one another. Our Tomas, who Eric knows well, who leads Enseña Chile, he's like, when we started doing this, we realized our friends, our partners are working in the exact same communities, and we're not even talking to one another because we've got these very individualistic ways of working, and it's part of our education systems. My kid does better than your kid. It's part of capitalism. We're competing for resources. And so the biggest thing we're learning is let's start by asking these bigger questions, and how do you start creating spaces to do this collectively? I can say a lot more, but Patty, I'm curious if
No, I think that you are super getting to the point. I think that at least in the Mexican context, we're going through that process. I
yeah.
think that something that we have been reflecting, and I really hope that someone can just also write something on the chat or just raise their hand. But the thing is, we're trying to build together an ecosystem where we are trying to think which are the questions that we haven't been seriously answering
Yeah.
from the perspective and from the needs of the students, not from the needs of the organization or the needs of the funders, but we are truly thinking where should we drive the change together and how we should do that. And I will just maybe ask something on regarding that, which is about the qualities of those leaderships. I think that it's also very difficult to say like this is the list of, but from your experience, from all the places that you travel
Yeah.
every year and all the time, what is the common denominator that you see in people that is aiming to work together?
Yeah, yeah. And I'll get very real here because again, we can throw on fancy terms and this is where it breaks down. And myself also having to practice collective leadership on a daily basis, I wrestle with this every day. So I can be very, very real. I mean, I think the first thing is, when I have seen collective leadership at play, like the first thing is when you can center something bigger than yourself. So when I've actually seen it work, it comes down to, what we say is it's bringing diverse people together towards a common purpose, and especially those who've experienced the injustices we're facing, or especially those who are affected, right? Like students or parents, which are oftentimes missing. So this idea of, first of all, getting to shared purpose. And so oftentimes we don't even have a shared sense of the problem, right? Like I was talking to Tomas, who heads our organization in Chile, and he's like, we're working in a district where there's really poor educational outcomes. I think like 27% of the kids were having like basic foundations in math and literacy, and it's like there's not even a shared sense of the problem, right? And so the first thing is like when you have a shared sense of the problem, and then you can get a shared sense of, well, what are we working towards? And there's the commitment to something bigger than yourself. And by the way, that is not a small process to get to, right? That's when I see people starting to work together. When you start, you strip out your roles and your titles, and you're like, well, what do you want for your kids? And what do you want for my kids? And so there's that element of like thinking about something bigger than yourself. But I think what really that takes is a number of things, and a lot of it is unlearning. So it is unlearning. So it's not just about learning, but it is unlearning a lot of what we have grown up with. So it's unlearning I think the individualistic mindsets that for many of us are not part of our cultures. Like I grew up in an Indian culture where it's very community based. But then I grew up in a Western culture where everything was around individualism, right? You compete for money, you compete for grades. And so it's unlearning this idea that I am separate from you. Um, it means letting go of ego, right? A lot of the reasons that we don't collaborate is you develop a program, you think you're like the first person who's developed it, you think my way is the best way. So a lot of it is letting go, right? Letting go of ego. And again, when I've seen people do it, it's when they've started realizing, we're in service of something bigger than ourselves. it's navigating like deeper root issues. It's like willingness to do the deeper inner work to talk about things like power and who holds power in a system and who doesn't. And that's quite difficult, right? Like by the virtue of the fact that like all of us are sitting here and we went to a really top graduate school, you know, we may be in the 1% elite, and these are uncomfortable conversations. But if we can't recognize that, gosh, we might be missing a big piece of the puzzle, then honestly, we're just going to replicate the things that work for us and realize, well, there's a whole segment of the population where the rules don't work for them, right? And, you know, and this is where some of the unlearning happens. And, you know, it's this idea of, you know, oftentimes if you've made it, like I come from an immigrant family and I've made it. And what I learned when I was growing up was like, well, but we're immigrants, we made it up by our bootstraps and it was all us. And so I believed hard work and persistence matters. And I believe that now. But I've also discovered that the footstools are set up for some children differently. And so unless we can have those deeper conversations around, well, what are the root causes? And why is it that some children like don't have the same opportunities as that? And until we can also start realizing, well, what's my role in that? And that takes some courage and that takes difficult conversations. And so these are some of the types of things I've seen. Yeah, I hope that helps a little bit, Patty.
No, no, super helpful. And I do think that you make me think about methodologies to make that happen.
Yeah.
I know that you have been going through that in terms of, and you open the word in this conversation about saying unlearning.
Yeah.
And I do think that it is not about, and going back to something that you said, like it's not about the shared purpose, but the shared problem. And I think that from that perspective, we do have a long work to do. So have you seen any methodologies that have impressed you in terms of when you put that in the center of the room,
Yeah.
something happened that I've never thought that will happen, or it is, I don't know, the theory of change methodology. Like, can you just share with us some of those like tools
Yeah, sure,
that
sure.
we've seen moving forward in terms of the shared purpose?
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of different things. I'll throw out a few different things I've seen. You know, the first is, can you actually bring a diverse group of people together? And can you create safety where you can have a conversation that's a very human conversation? So oftentimes, like one of the things I always do is who's in the room. So the first thing I always ask is who's in the room and who's missing, right? So in this conversation, oh, okay, I'm noticing we're having a conversation around education. There's no students here. I'm noticing we're having a conversation and there's no teachers here. Great. So like that's the first thing. The first thing to do is to have unlearning is you want to have a cross section of society in the room, and that's almost always not happening in many of our organizations. Like if you look at your phone and you look at your top 10 people, you probably talk to people who are similar from you.
Oh,
And so that's the first thing we try to do is like, well, how do you start creating spaces where people can come together from different walks of life? But because by virtue of just doing that, you're going to create the space to actually hear something different. Then you actually have to prime the space so there's actually safety, right? So there's actually safety to have that conversation. And, you know, and that requires work of, you know, how do you invite people in? You know, how do you create protocols where everyone can sort of share their voice? But honestly, sometimes it's super, super simple, right? Asking the one or two powerful questions like, you know, tell me about the education system you grew up in and what was it working towards? Like I will tell you, I grew up in an education system. It wasn't bad, but it's all about achievement. It was all about individual achievement and, you know, who kind of gets higher up in life and gets a good job and gets security. Like that's the education system I grew up in. And you just start having that conversation and have people tell stories, right? And just in those stories, you hear a lot. Like just as for example, when I was growing up, well, I grew up in Canada. I had a twin sister, and my first language was Gujarati, an Indian language, right? At 3 or 4 years old, I remember my sister and I were trying to teach the kids our language, and we got reprimanded. And our parents would get called in, and we're just told, "Can you please have your children speak English? Like, have them not talk in Gujarati, right?" And so, at a young age, I learned that there's a piece of me that I can bring into the school and work, and there's a piece of me that I have to hold back, right? So now imagine like I'm now having this conversation, but with a government leader and a student and a teacher, and all of us have these experiences. We've all gone through schooling. Immediately, you just start building a sense of, okay, now I start to see what's not working, and then from there, you can ask the question about, all right, well, what do we want? And sometimes it's as simple as that. Like we actually haven't created the spaces to come together, to ask the questions of like, well, what is the education system we were working in, and what didn't work, and what do we want? And if you just do that from a place of shared humanity, and through stories and connecting one-on-one, like even that starts opening up a conversation. That's the beginning of it. I will also say that when you start doing that, a lot of the other work we've been doing is actually spending a lot of time on the work of healing. Because when you start opening up conversations like that, really with a diverse section of society, like we will see pretty horrible things we've done. And so in Canada, where I grew up, recently I've been following the news, and there's just a lot of horrific stuff about what we have done to our Indigenous people. And when I was growing up, and this is really embarrassing to say, but like the dialogue was like, well, they're into alcohol, or they're not doing well, or they're rebelling, right? But there was no understanding of the history of these kids who were taken away from their parents and put in these residential schools, and stripped of their language and stripped of their culture, and many of them often died in those schools, and like none of this stuff we learned. And so if you're walking around in society saying, well, these people don't work hard, or all these assumptions, and you don't understand any of the history or context, like there's a lot that needs to be healed there. So I think that's another capacity, that if we really want to transform systems, we have to have these conversations. But we also have to create space for, wow, like there's a lot that hasn't worked and a lot of people have suffered. And how do we create space for that? Because if we can integrate that, if we stop ignoring it and we can be with it, then actually these things don't have to be passed on to the next generation. But if we don't, it shows up everywhere. It shows up in the way we show up with people. It shows up about the assumptions of, we think that person's smart or not. It shows up in, oh, we need a pedigree to be in this conversation. It shows up to who we listen to. So yeah, just those are some of the things that come up.
I love it. I love it. I have like 7 more minutes with you, and
Okay.
then that one area will just jump in and bring the questions of who is with us. So start like just put in the questions on the chat, please. So, okay. So first of all, I do think that you're pointing out something very important. And I think there's a tension from what we want rather than what is really happening in the system or in the educational system that we're working with or for. And as you were just sharing your experience of what about the news of Canada, I just can say that um, we have been for the last 2 days, I mean, for many weeks, and I think many, many weeks in Mexico, but last 2 days, um, suddenly they found the authorities extermination camps in Mexico,
Yeah.
in parts
Yeah.
of the country, where people has been killed.
Yeah.
And when we think and when we see those pictures, it truly makes me going crazy and cry and feel frustrated. And I think that you have, and I think that we all have felt the same things in our countries, independently where we were born or where we live. So I love how you mentioned the thing about healing, Raja. I do think that it is not only about our work and our daily work that worth doing that, but how we heal together towards a bigger purpose and a bigger mission that is kids are right now going into schools or not going into schools, but they feel at least that there's a sense of hope in those classrooms, in those connections with their friends, with other students or with their teachers. So so I was just like I will not allow myself not asking you about your book. I think that you went deep into the professional perspective, which I love it. But why don't you just share with us about your book? I think that what's the name? What was it about? Why you wrote about the topic? I think that you are the owner of that voice, and I would think it will be amazing to hear that from you. And then going and circle down in terms of how all those spots that have been happening to your life, Raja,
Mhm.
is how do you feel that could work, or how do you imagine all the things that you are doing, you have written, you have lived in the next 10 or 15 years? Like, what's your vision
Oh, good, good. Big
for
question.
that all
Okay.
spots connecting?
Okay. Let's see. I'll see what I can take. These are great questions. Okay. A couple of things. So, there's two books. I'll just share two words on each. So one was, 4 or 5 years ago, at the peak of the pandemic, I fell very ill. I was one of the first people in New York City to fall ill with COVID. This was before there was any vaccines, anyone knew anything. This is when they were making makeshift hospitals. And I went from, dynamic, like building a whole new team, to bedridden, and nobody knew what to do. They found lesions in my brain. My heart stopped working. I had a best friend who's a doctor, and they just didn't know if I was going to make it. And it was months and months and months on end of being able to get up for 10 minutes and then collapsing, and 10 minutes and collapsing. And it's when you go through these things in life that it changes everything. It changes everything in you. And so the only thing I managed to do in that process, thankfully I had, again, this collective group around me. So I learned a lot about my work was right. It was the only thing I could do, because there'd be moments of lucidity. And so I shared the story of in some ways, all the work that I'd been doing, whether with CEOs or teachers or others, this inner work, saying, part of the inner work is knowing yourself. Part of the work is knowing when to reach out to help. Part of the work is learning to get support and building support networks. While I've been saying that, actually, for me, this was a matter of survival. Part of it was learning to heal trauma. It was learning to how to work not just with our intellectual minds, but our bodies. It was learning how to question things that didn't work in the system. I can tell you all my qualms with the healthcare system, but it was similar with the education system. Everybody's working in silos. I had 10 different doctors working on different body parts. Nobody could see the whole. The heart doctor gives me something that has me pass out. Then they give me something that I can't keep food down. And so it was a journey. But I think these moments in life, I think they teach you things. And so I think, what I've come to realize is from that is like, actually, whatever we're trying to do to transform systems around us, it all starts in here with us. And, those were the moments where I learned to build relationships. Those are the moments where I learned to ask what matters. Those are the moments I learned to slow down and actually create time and space for the questions that really make a difference. Those are the times when I learned that we don't actually have to heal the things that are happening in our system alone. We actually can do that together. So actually, all of that stuff, and I learned the science of it, I learned my own personal relationship to it. All of that actually like helped me with the work that I'm doing, because now it's not a intellectual understanding. I'm like, I really get what it's like when groups of people come together around someone. I really get that there can be a different way. Yeah. And we ended up writing a second book. I edited it, which is actually fun. If you ever want to read it, it's an ebook. It's the leadership we need now. And so in some ways, it's an embodiment and collective leadership. We got 20 different leaders, from students to, a student in Ukraine during the time of the war, to a teacher in Nigeria, to a policymaker in Peru. And we just asked them the question, what's the leadership we need now? So in there, I had written a piece around, actually, the leadership we need now is this idea of connectedness and healing. But as again, in the spirit of collective leadership, I think each of us have a perspective. And I think that was just an embodiment of, well, instead of trying to do things ourselves, let's see what the wisdom is in the room. Yeah. And my hopes for the future, I am hopeful. The things that make me hopeful are young people. I think if we can get out of the way and actually like not put all of our baggage on them, like I have seen such incredible young people who are leading things around changing climate or changing things in their communities. I see this all the time, so it gives me a lot of hope. But what my work is for the next, 10 or 15 years is, I think if we actually want things to change, we always are doing the doing out there. We're trying to do technical fixes or policy changes. And what I've come to realize from my own health journey, from where I'm seeing transformation, is so much of it starts in here with us. So if we can know ourselves, if we can understand our own past trauma and heal that a little bit so we're not bringing it into our systems, if we can learn to be in relationship with one another in a different way, if we can then start building teams who can start operating in different ways, not based on like trauma and triggers, but on like, okay, what are we going to achieve together? So that's a lot of work I'm doing right now around deep performing teams and systems that operate in a radically different way, then I do think we can take on a lot of the challenges of our time. So yeah, what I'm committed to is just working with whole now teams and systems to do that personal work, but also the collective work to operate in different way and challenge our mindsets and operate from a belief that, I mean, my number one belief is if we really get that we're interconnected, like Eric, that my fate is intertwined with yours, or Patty, that my fate is intertwined with yours, and we really get that, which I got through my whole health battle, it does change everything. So, and to be honest, we're much happier. We're actually much happier because the minute you're riled up and you've got your fists up and you're trying to protect yourself, what we don't realize, it's like it's killing us also. So I'm up for trying to shift some of these big paradigms that I think if we did, could actually transform education, but also the world. Yeah.
I love it. Thanks for that. Like not ending, but quite a final, very final remarks of this first part of the conversation. I will hand over to Gustavo or Eric. Maybe we just can share some of the questions and open the floor. Maybe Gustavo, you're getting it?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you,
Go
Patty.
ahead.
Radha, it's been really a very inspiring opportunity, getting to learn from your perspective how leadership plays a pivotal role in transforming both the circumstances in which we need to deliver high quality education, but also overall just the more plain human interaction behind every endeavor that relates to solving something that affects all of us. Because I think that many of the things we have discussed under the umbrella of what goes on in education transfer to some of the other very urgent and pressing challenges. And you mentioned some of them. You spoke about the relevance of thinking in collective leadership when it came to the climate change and many of the challenges that many countries in the world are now facing, both individually as national units and also just internationally as a global community, right? And we do have some questions from the audience, and we would love to hear your thoughts first on the issue of difficult conversations and their relationship with aha moments. So if you could elaborate a little bit on that. We also have some comments pertaining the influence of strong forces in today's world, such as new technologies, and how these emerging technologies, such as ChatGPT, are transforming the education sector and extending that to perhaps how are they having an impact on this necessity to build bridges of collaboration with others through collective leadership, right? And finally, perhaps if and this is I will take advantage of the fact that I'm posing the questions. We have a new one, and it has to do with letting go. I mean, I think that part resonated a lot. The unlearning. When we study education policy, we often come across policymakers trying to come up with something new to do, with new strategies, with new approaches, but we hardly ever consider what it is that we need to let go. Um, So I think that resonates a lot with the last question about shifting those long-seated mindsets, right? And how do you see that actually changing in the minds of leaders?
Yeah, all great questions. I'm really glad someone asked around the difficult conversations because, like, if you boil it down to it, transforming systems is human work and it's relational work. Like I have never seen, you get these beautiful, perfect policies. Whether I was working, I remember when I was in healthcare and I was working in Bihar, one of the poorest states in India, this pre-Teach for All. And I remember went to a government office and he's like, we built these great health clinics. And then I would go visit and literally there was nothing there. And in the places where I actually saw something, it had nothing to do with the perfectly prescribed policy, the well-written technical document, the nicely wordsmithed thing. It was actually, there was somebody in that community that was a government official or parents or others that were like making things happen. And so I do think system change is human work and it's relational work. And so the biggest thing I think, one of the capacities that I think we need to build in our students and we need to build in all of ourselves is the ability to be in relationship. And that means navigating tension. I don't know if we use words like love in conversations like this, but the capacity that I'm trying to grow is how can we navigate tension with love? And the reason I say that is because actually, if we're trying to transform systems, we have to navigate tension. Like if we're actually trying to say something's not working, we don't want to shy away from it. So one of the capacities around navigating tension with love, and this is what I work with leaders on, and I'm doing a whole set of work with whole teams now and whole systems on this is, what if we assume that tension is natural? So we're not trying to make it go away, but we develop our capacity around it. And so we're doing a lot of work to say, okay, I'm noticing a trigger is coming up. What in that is me? So there's oftentimes a lot of self-work. Of 99% of my tensions and triggers, it has something to do with something unresolved in me. But then, there's a whole capacity around rupture and repair, right? So you're going to do systems change work and you're going to make mistakes. And I just spoke to 2 leaders who are leading really big transformations in systems over the last 2 days. And the number one thing they said, you have to know when to apologize. You have to learn how to repair. And so in some ways, I think we have to get out of this idea that it has to be, all beautiful and all loving. Like we are going to have some rupture and repair. And so what I say with skills like deep listening and compassion and relational work is I think this is lifelong work and we need to develop these capacities with the same rigor that we would say any technical skill, like how do you build strategy or math or reading for kids, but also for adults. And there's actually ways we can develop this. I just think the first thing is recognizing I'm going to put some energy into learning how to develop my capacity. Once you do, if anyone's interested, there's tons and tons of stuff here. So yeah, that was the first question. The second was AI. Gosh, I bet there's probably people in this room who have 10 times more wisdom on this. I would actually say young people have a lot of wisdom on this. So one of the first things I realized is, Patty, you might remember this. We were at the Salzburg convening on the future of teaching. And I find this quite comical. And so there's a bunch of adults in the room and a couple of students. And like we were all talking at each other and trying to say, what do we think? And at some point, I'm like, I don't think we've heard from the youngest person in the room. And in a second, they gave us far, far, far more wisdom. And so I think that with the AI thing, a couple of things that come to mind is one, how do we, again, when I think about this like work of collectives and education, it's like, how do we make sure that we're hearing students' voice and students' perspectives and really listening and not judging? A lot of students say teachers are afraid. Many students are saying, I feel comfortable, more comfortable asking dumb questions to AI than I do to someone else. By the way, I do that too. I do that too. I'm like, I can ask it all my dumb questions. So I think there's a lot of power and there's a lot of risks. I think my biggest reflection right now on AI is if, AI needs to be compounded with the right leadership. And so where I have seen like a teacher or responsible policymaker, like really thinking through, like, what are the ramifications of this? How can this apply? That's when it's powerful. And when I see the absence of it, that's what's scary. And so I think with any technology, for me, the first thing it comes back to is like, well, how are we developing the capacity of our people who are on the front lines to grow their leadership to even have the conversations, because the conversation on AI tomorrow is going to be different than it was yesterday. So again, it's not about the technical fix. Where I've seen like really transformative stuff, it's like you develop the leadership of the teachers, the students, and they can actually leverage it in the right way. So yeah, I don't know that I'm the best person to answer that, but that's my relationship with the question. I bet others have good thoughts. And Gustavo, remind me the last question you had
Yeah,
shared.
it had to do with the unlearning, with the letting go, and
Oh, okay.
how,
Yeah.
from your experience, how does that process in leaders look like? Not only in terms of like their performance, but actually their mindsets.
Yeah. And so just like think about for a moment when you've had to unlearn something or let it go, right? Um, it is, and I say this again, I think it's the same as what I'd said about the developing, the learning, the new capacities. I think it's lifelong work. I am constantly unlearning. The more I grow, the more I'm unlearning. And so at the beginning, like even just introducing the idea that we have things to unlearn, that can be a radical idea. Um, I found that there's like a set of leaders that once they get that and you start doing it over and over and over again, you build the humility. But sometimes it can be super disruptive because some of the things we're unlearning, right? Like, again, our relationship to power, how we might have contributed to the system that it is today, some of the things that we've learned from our childhood. Um, that stuff is so deeply ingrained, not just in us, but in society. Like, I actually think we need to unlearn this idea of like me over you. But our whole society, what we celebrate individual leaders. You get promotions based on that. You get a salary and safe base based on that. So I think unlearning is not just individual work, but it's collective work. Um, but I would also say that when we do that, there's nothing more liberating. When we actually learn to let go of the things that are not serving us or others. And so yeah, I don't think there's any easy answers on it. I think we're oftentimes going up against entire systems that are built another way. Um, but that's when I think we have communities and we can start doing some of this in whole communities. So I have seen, like, I'll just give one specific example. Um, in Haiti, corporal punishment used to be a really big thing in schools. And so they had like whole communities get together and actually like wrestle with like people's relationships with it. And, you know, it brought up a lot for people. For some people, they're like, well, that's how I was disciplined and that got me the way that I was. I wouldn't have succeeded. And others started realizing, well, there's a whole colonial history of it. But when that unlearning started happening in a community, like you actually saw whole communities shifting. And so like in now whole communities, that practice no longer exists, but that was not a one day thing. It was like really wrestling with like some of the deepest beliefs that we have. So yeah, I don't know if that's a helpful answer, but I just think it's lifelong work. It's the work we absolutely have to do right now. And there's a lot of processes where we can actually begin to do that. One of the best ways is to go experience something in a completely different context, because that oftentimes challenges your own worldview. So that's how I do a lot of my own unlearning. Or go talk to someone. Like this is a good one. Maybe this is homework for anyone who wants to do this. Think about who you talk to and go talk to somebody from the complete other political spectrum and allow yourself to listen to them. And actually, before you do, note down every single judgment you have of them. Like write down everything you're thinking, the things you wouldn't want to say. Cross that out and see if you can put that aside even for 5 minutes and just be with them. And by the way, it's very difficult. But like for me, that's a big unlearning because actually, when you can be with someone and get curious that has completely different views for you, like that's another form of unlearning that I just don't think we're doing enough in these times. So yeah.
That is super amazing. I think that is not only the thing that like the word that you mentioned and all about that you have developed unlearn, but also try to the thing about just put yourself into a different context where you never thought you could be or you would be. It's super challenging, right? But it is, it takes a lot of brave and a lot of will also to make that happen. So I don't know, Gustavo, Eric, if there's something happening in the chat that we should just mention before ending. We have
There is. There's
Okay,
actually
go ahead. Go ahead, Gustavo.
there's actually one last and very powerful question which goes around how education systems are skewed towards skilling in under the traditional labor market and so on. And when it comes to considering empathy as a weakness rather than a strength, right?
Yeah.
How can we push education systems on that direction by using collective leadership?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's the micro and the macro. I think you're raising the like, this is where a lot of the unlearning has to happen, like the fundamental paradigms. When we looked at transformational classrooms around the world, we said, actually, it's not around teachers gaining new skills, it's 4 orientations. We've got to see students as leaders, not as passive recipients as knowledge. We've got to see teachers as learners, not the know-it-all experts. We've got to see our work as systemic, which is, I think, where this gets to, like really questioning the biggest paradigms in our society. And we've got to see community as powerful and work with others. But this idea that our work is systemic, absolutely, like, and I think we can start doing this at a micro level and at a macro level. So at the micro level, like, you know, uh, I try to work with people, right? And so people, oftentimes I try to get out of the either or thinking. I'm like, of course we need employability skills, right? And, when we think about the type of work that we need in this time, so much of that requires critical thinking and relational work and being able to operate in teams. And so I try to not do the like, or thinking, because I just think that puts us in silos. So oftentimes when I face a dilemma like that, I'll, at a micro level, whether it's with an employer or someone teaching in a traditional way, like I try to offer them like, what would it look like if we did both and I often find there's receptiveness. So that's a micro. But at the macro, and this is why I do think we need all of us, nothing is going to fundamentally shift unless we actually start chipping away at these bigger things. And that is like, I think, a generation's worth of work. We need people in the media telling different stories. We need to question, why do we champion the folks who have made a ton of money, but not champion the teachers who are working collectively? Micro things I do is within my organization, I try to celebrate the people who are a little bit behind the scenes. I try to celebrate whole teams of people, not individuals. And so I just think in like small ways, we can start disrupting it. And some of it, especially in these times when things are just absolutely not working, this is the time to ask bigger questions around like our entire systems. And again, you're going up against the grain, but I think we can start doing it in micro ways. And then, yeah, it is a real paradigm shift. We'll have to put in place there. Yeah.
Oh my God, this has been so wonderful, amazing, inspiring. So happy to see many, many faces that got the chance to be here. And I really hope that this conversation, Raja, gets very far, far and deep in our networks and with our friends, and that things can change or can still change, and can be also move the conversation from another perspective that we needed very, very urgently.
Yeah, Patty, the last thing I'll say is even though we talk about all the things that are not working, I do have hope, because actually, I've been at this for like the last 20 years, but I think particularly in these times when things are troubled, this is when you actually see small pockets of people operating in radically different ways. And I'm starting to see that. And so that's where I'm like, this is the time. If we want to try something different, this is the time. And I have seen small groups of people, and more I'm seeing them connecting with one another, and particularly some of our young people. And so, yeah. But I hope next time I can join the space and just be a participant and learn from your wisdom as well, because I can just see there's a lot of that in the room. So yeah, thank you for having
Absolutely.
me.
Thanks, Raja, for your time. And I don't know, Eric, if I've missing something, but I have been honored to lead this conversation and also to share this space with you all. And please go into our networks and social networks, and please connect and enroll and be part of the Harvard Alumni for Education, again, for free. But it's a beautiful pretext to get connected and to heal together. That's also something that you mentioned, Raja, and I will be so happy also to be part of many, many other conversations with more and more amazing people of this network, or many others that we don't know yet. So thank you very much for your time, for sharing, for being part of this beautiful conversation. And Raja, lots of hugs and best wishes, and thanks for your hope, and thanks for your words.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.